Mrs. Zychski, you are one of the last contemporary witnesses from the immediate surroundings of Hermann Göring and his family. From 1937 to 1945, you and your husband were caretakers in Hermann Göring's country house on the Obersalzberg. After Göring's arrest, you and your family returned to the bombed-out Obersalzberg on May 1st, 1945, and took up quarters in these rooms, the former apartment of the Luftwaffe Adjutant General Bodenschatz. This interview is now being recorded in exactly the same rooms that you moved into in May 1945, in the former adjutant's office of Hermann Göring. Mrs. Zychski, we are now very curious to hear your story.
Als wir 1937 hierher kamen,
when we came here in 1937, the small Goering house was still there, with the small annex which was big enough because the Reichsmarshal was very rarely here at that time. For 10 days out of each year, he was here for vacation. Later, it turned out that when the bombing raids on Berlin took place, Mrs. Goering and her daughter Etta came here to the Goering house, and Goering visited them every now and then.
Und besuchte sie nur hier und da. In
the years we have been here, 1937, 1938, 1939, he was here for 10 days each approximately, maybe sometimes 14 days. Then he went to his hunting grounds at the end of Koenigse Lake to hunt. That changed later with the beginning of the war completely. His family came here in 1941, after the bombing of Berlin began. With the child, it would have been very difficult in Berlin. Etta was born in 1938. And because of the bombing, they would have not been able to sleep peacefully. So the family came here. But only the wife with the daughter and her necessary staff. Of course, the house always had to be in such a condition that he could come in at any time. He also often came unannounced during the construction period. He suddenly stood in the yard with all the entourage, but since he was very, very sociable, he had put up with it all. And if he announced himself, then of course everything was prepared to be fancy and beautiful. Special flowers were bought and vases were placed everywhere, and everything was lovingly decorated. Otherwise, everything happened as usual. The wife was there and the child, and the household ran as usual. And when he came, additional staff and personnel staff came. Then in 1937, the construction began on the adjutant's office building, which would then house the staff and the office staff. There were also guest rooms and the apartment for General Bodenschatz. We continued to use this apartment after the war and are still in it today. In 1941, an addition was built to house the family because they moved from Berlin to Obersalzberg and more space was needed. With the remodeling of the house, a small house bunker was also built, which was partly above ground and partly underground. In 1943, another large bunker was built under the hill as air raids increased rapidly. The bunker was paid for by Hermann Göring himself, not as mistakenly thought that the entire bunker system was built together. I remember that from the difficulties there were with the money transfer. Then money arrived at the administration Obersalzberg, and they asked us why and why again. And my husband could only say that the Reichsmarshal didn't want that. He wanted to pay for his bunker himself. The country house was beautifully furnished with really beautiful precious things that they all gathered individually, and partly also put together with the advice of architects. There were always unique pieces that they found on the way through Berchtesgaden. Here a Madonna, and there a cross. There was sometimes a bowl. It was not uniform, and it was a beautiful country house style.
Es wurde immer wieder, es war nicht einheitlich, es war ein wunderschöner Landhausstil und ergänzt, ohne jemals flickwert zu werden. Wie sie ankamen,
Then, when the new building was finished and his wife moved in, actually, it wasn't quite finished.
war längst nicht fertig.
The floor layers were still there, and they just pulled his desk up over the balcony,
Und den Schreibtisch
while he was already down in the hall with his family.
schon unten in der Halle mit seiner Familie war. Und dann mein Mann
My husband then tried to distract Goering a bit to gain time, so he showed him various other innovations at the house. Goering and his wife immediately understood what it was all about and willingly let him show them the innovations in the rooms.
gesagt, komm Emmy, guck mal dies noch und das.
Later he said, "Emmy, I think they are ready now. We can go up now."
Die haben sich blendend verstanden.
Then the desk was finally in place and the helpers had disappeared over the balcony.
Aufgeben. Und da war der Schreibtisch endlich an seiner Stelle und der Mann über den Balkon hinaus wieder. Jedenfalls hat
Anyway, he was interested in archery and curling.
auch so am Eisschießen haben wir doch am
We had a curling rink, but little was played on it.
nicht mehr. Mein Mann hat immer ausgeschippt und gemacht, aber es wurde nie mehr. Der Sonne ist zu heiß.
During the day, the sun thawed the surface, and by the time Goering had time to play later in the day, the ice was already too soft.
Zum Eisschießen, dann war das zu weich, die Oberfläche.
Göring was also a skier, right?
Yes, but unfortunately I don't know anything more about it.
Did he never ski?
No, he once stood on the boards on the hill in front of the house, but that was all. Then his daughter Edda also learned to ski. His wife didn't go, so he went up the hill with his daughter and watched her. He had to be able to make tours. He always went mountain climbing in his hunting area in the Roth.
In die Berge ging und sein Jagdgebiet in der Röth wird ja auch gebraucht haben dann, nicht?
It is said that he was very active in his hunting grounds in the Röth.
Ja, sicher.
Yes, certainly. He could climb mountains very well. He also once climbed the Kehlstein.
Die Kehlsteinstraße.
He had tied a big white cloth around his head and then he went off.
Das Tuch so um den Stirn gelegt, der Schweiß auf.
But he quickly came back because around every corner a security officer was watching him.
Tempo guckte, nicht?
He said, "I can't even go there alone. They're after me everywhere." They only wanted to protect him. They had the order, but he was unwilling. He did not want that. He claims that no one would hurt him.
Aber war unwillig.
Who should hurt me here? I don't hurt anybody. That was always his talk.
Wer soll mir hier was tun? Ich tue keinem was. Ne? War auch immer sein Reden.
Was it a security area independent of Bormann's security area?
Die Röth.
I think the Roth was. Yeah, the Roth was.
How was his house secured? Who organized it?
Wir hatten einen Posten.
There was a guard who went around the house and was repeatedly relieved. That was all. Nothing more. There were 2 security officers who accompanied the daughter Edda and Goering's wife when they left the house. They lived down here.
Und wenn sie rausgingen, mussten die natürlich mit, das ist klar.
Mrs. Zychski, in 1944 there were disagreements when Bormann's and the Reichsmarschall's bunker should be connected. Do you know anything about this?
Goering said he wanted his bunker alone, without Bormann. That's what he told me. Then he drove away someday. Shortly thereafter, Bormann called and said that the chamber must be cleared because the merge of the bunkers was taking place.
Heute Nachmittag, das waren nur noch 2-3 Stunden waren dazwischen, nicht? Die würde gesprengt und dass wir nicht da die Sachen vorstellen hätten und so weiter.
The partition was to be blown up and we were to clear the things away from the wall so that nothing would be broken.
Ich wollte das doch nicht haben. Doch, ich habe ja mit ihm gesprochen.
Then I said that the Reichsmarschall did not want that. Bormann, however, said that they had discussed it that way.
Sag ich, was machen wir jetzt? Ja, sagt er, nein. Ich sage, ja, der sprengt.
Then we called Goering in East Prussia. He was very annoyed that we disturbed him, but what could we do?
Angerufen draußen in Ostpreußen,
We told him the conversation with Bormann.
umgehalten, dass wir nicht stören, aber es half ja alles.
Finally, he sent a message and then the matter was settled.
Dann sagen Sie ihm und daraufhin haben wir dann gesagt, nein. Wir
The
können
bunker
es
was not put together and nothing was blown up.
Hausmeisters, nicht? Und ja, was soll ich denn da machen? Na, dann haben wir gesagt, schnell einen Adjutanten und das sofort. Er will in 2 Stunden, da war es ja schon ganz kurz vorher, will er sprengen. Und der sprengt. Na, das will ich mal sehen, nicht? Na, strikt Verbot. Und dann habe ich nochmal angerufen, habe ich gesagt, Herr Reichsmarschall ist verständigt und Sie werden Kürze Nachricht bekommen vom Hauptquartier. Habe ich nichts mehr gehört davon. Also unser Bunker blieb alleine und war unsere Rettung.
What was the daily routine of Hermann Göring when he was at the Obersalzberg?
Also das weiß ich nicht. Er war ein großer Frühaufsteher.
Mr. Goering was a great early riser. He got up very early, then he sat on the balcony and read the newspapers. From 10 o'clock on, he was usually already over at Hitler's house for a situation briefing, to which he was always a little late. When that was finished, he came back and we had lunch. But it could also be in the afternoon or even in the evening. Then he spent time with his family. Goering was a family person. Sometimes he called my husband or an adjutant. There was always something to do in the few days he was here. He was busy, and sometimes he went for a swim in the pool.
Erzeugt 14 Grad, 18 Grad, sowas in der Dreh. Da geht der schwimmen.
What was the difference between the Göring country house and the rest of the Obersalzberg restricted area?
Goering's house was a purely private residence. There were no official receptions or anything like that. There were hardly ever any visitors here. It did happen that Hitler stopped by on the occasion of Emmy's or Edda's birthday. But otherwise, there weren't hardly any visitors.
On April 23, 1945, Göring was arrested by the SS at Obersalzberg in his country house. What happened then?
Februar. Ich mache noch größer bis April. 23. April, ja. Das war montags. Am Samstag.
Goering arrived on Saturday. That must have been April 21st. On Monday, the news arrived that Hitler had collapsed and Berlin had been taken. Then Goering was supposed to take over. At first, there were problems with the radio connection to Berlin.
Musste dann eigentlich die Vertretung übernehmen. Und da wurde gefunkt hin und her, dann kriegten wir Berlin nicht, dann kam Berlin verstückelt hier an. Jedenfalls hat das auf gar keinen Fall mit unserem Funkwagen geklappt. Und da sollte ja dann abends eine Rede.
Then, in the evening, a speech was actually to be given.
Und dazu kam es nicht mehr, denn um 3 Uhr.
Goering wanted to give the speech, but it didn't come to that because we were arrested at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The arrest was very strange. I wanted to go out and feed the animals, but the CID officers didn't let us out. The house was being surrounded. Mortars pointed toward the house. They told us that if I went out, they would have to shoot.
Und dann sagte der Herr Brandenburg aber doch, sagt er, nehmen Sie es bitte ernst, wir wissen selbst nicht, was los ist. Gehen Sie nicht aus dem Haus.
At first I thought this was a bad joke. But then I quickly realized that it was not a joke. The CID officer then fed the chickens for me.
Gucken, was los ist, standen sie auch alle ums Haus herum. Fast, naja, schulternahe ist Quatsch, aber wie nennt man das, wenn man so Armlänge weit auseinander? Und Mörser zum Haus gestellt.
I went to the front to see what was going on. The house was completely surrounded and my husband was not allowed to go anywhere. But the windows had to be blacked out. But how was this to be done? He then went over to other buildings via the heating corridor, up into the first floor and darkened Goering's rooms.
Hat überall verdunkelt beim Chef durch und der erkundigte sich dann, wie sieht's draußen aus? Ist alles ruhig?
So there was already a tense atmosphere on Tuesday. Everyone was locked in his room. On Wednesday morning, the alarm went off. We hardly slept during the night, and in the morning, the alarm went off. We didn't know what was going on at all. We all quickly went down into the bunker. We didn't even go into the small house bunker, but directly into the big one. My husband welcomed us downstairs and took us into our cavern, and then there were very loud explosions.
What were the conditions like down in the bunker during the attack?
Already after the first bombs, the electricity and water had gone out, destroyed by the bombs. Then we sat downstairs in darkness. Candles were unfortunately not enough available. All the guards were down in the bunker with us. There were over 120 people down there. The next day, there was no bread left, no water, nothing. The food was very bad down there and far too little.
Ganz schäbige Sabotage, das kann ich ganz ehrlich sagen, denn anders kann ich es mir nicht vorstellen.
There were boxes of vinegar essence and celery and unburnt bean coffee and black tea. But what good is that without a fire or water?
Das zweite war aufgebrochen, weiß ich nicht, wo das geblieben ist. Stangensellerie, ungebrannten Bohnenkaffee war da. Es war auch schwarzer Tee da. Aber was macht man damit?
There was also no bread the next day. My husband had to drive down to Berchtesgaden and had brought one single loaf, one bread for 120 men. We had to get out. There was no other way. The children had diarrhea from the confusion. The conditions were catastrophic. After that, we were deported. We had to leave the Obersalzberg. We were still in internment. I was separated from my husband at the very end, and we were taken to Glasenbach, nearby Salzburg. On Saturday, the Göring family, along with their staff, was deported to Mauterndorf, Austria. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how that went. As far as I know, they wanted to bring him first to Mauterndorf, but then he was brought to Fischhorn Castle, and from there, the liberation took place. On Monday, May 7th, 1945, Hermann Göring went into the hands of the 36th U.S. Infantry Division. Earlier, his adjutant, Colonel Bernd von Brauchwitsch, had negotiated the capture.
Mrs. Zychski, thank you very much for this interview.